Hi, I'm Martin. And it's good to be with you. And if you haven't noticed, I'm just going to let you know and highlight it that you have a tremendous team of elders serving this church community. What a blessing to serve with them. Yeah, that's worth the thanks. Yeah. And just to piggyback as well, it's been a long process, and whoever saw COVID coming and all that kind of stuff, but they are doing due diligence and faithful service during this season, and just so that you know, they know this, and we started this process, so this is very clear. I don't have any dates on the calendar, I don't have any marked. We're all here to see this through till we all see that it's the right place where God would have it, so, it's just a real blessing to be part of a ministry and leadership team that functions that way. So keep them in prayer, because we're praying for our church and what God is doing here, and He's doing a lot of great things, don't you think? So let me pray, and then you could turn to Luke chapter 15. You ought to have that page about worn out now, and the story just about memorized, I think. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your presence here. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you that you have created the church. You gave birth to this thing that we're a part of. You gave birth to us in it. And Jesus, we acknowledge fully and readily and thankfully that you are the head of the church. So in all things, corporately, as your body, individually, as we lead our own lives, we look to you, your will, your word. We trust you. We thank you for the trust that you've placed in us to be your ambassadors here in this world. We want to do that fully. We want to do that faithfully. We know that is not only an avenue of blessing in our own lives, but it is the way that your blessing enters into this world. So build up your church today in us individually so that we can live as your church in the days that you've given us. For the sake of your name, we pray. Amen? All right, just one quick announcement before I get into the message. And this Wednesday from 6 to 7, out in the pavilion, there's going to be food, and students and families 4th through 8th grade. The youth ministry team wants to meet with you, kind of share thoughts, get feedback from you. And again, you talk about great teams. That is a great team at work. We are so blessed to have that. So 6 to 7, come on out and catch some of their vision, some of their excitement, but also, again, as I said, they want to hear your concerns and, answer your questions for you. So we are in part 3 of There and Back Again. And this story is one of the best known and well known and most liked of all the parables that Jesus told. And I think for good reason. There's a man named Robert Robinson who lived some years and years ago. And his father died when he was just very young. And it launched him into a lot of chaos in his life, and he went down the wrong path for early on. But when he was 9 years old, he gave his life to Christ because he took some of his delinquent friends to go hear a guy named George Whitefield preach. And he surrendered his life on that occasion, and that then he felt called into ministry. He was mentored into that, and soon it became very apparent that he was very gifted in that. And God was bearing a great deal of fruit through his life, and he had a lot of influence, and his, not fame, but influence and impact really shot up. But along the way, he eventually fell into immorality, and as fast as things were going good for him, they all collapsed around him. And he left the ministry, he walked away from his calling, and he wallowed really in his failure. One day, that same man, Robert Robinson was his name, was riding on a stagecoach, and there was a woman on there he didn't know, but apparently she just wanted to kind of break the silence, and she said to him, I'm reading some lines I find interesting, and I'd like to know what you think about them. Would it be okay if I read them to you? And we discussed them as we traveled. And I'm not sure whether she waited for an answer or just jumped into it. And here's the first line she read to him. She said, "Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace, streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise." And she looked at him and said, "Sir, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts?" And he looked away and, try to change the subject and avoid it. But she persisted. In fact, she read some more of the lyric, and she went on and said, Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I am constrained to be. Let that goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. And she looked at him and said, Sir, what do you think about those lines? And he reportedly said this. He hung his head and said, Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man who wrote that hymn many years ago. And I would give 1,000 worlds, if I had them, to enjoy the feelings I had then. Prone to wonder, Lord, I know it. Prone to leave the God I love. It's an all too familiar story, isn't it? We have that proclivity. And Jesus tells this story to speak into that. And one of the reasons he tells this story, and I said last week, all three stories he tells in this chapter responds to the same thing and really settle on the single point, because underlying all the reasons why we live our lives away from God, why we settle in places distant from God in our lives, in our decisions, one of the big reasons for that, and one of the reasons why we don't come home, is because we have a distorted image about who God is. And as a result of that, we really don't understand ourselves or our own lives. And so Jesus, wanting to clarify that, tells this story, and I'm going to start with verse 11 again in Luke 15. Jesus continued, There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired men. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. And again, I want to stop there. Next week we'll get into the end of the story and wrap up this series. But I want to really kind of zero in on just on those verses like 17 through 20. And I want to talk about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves a little bit this morning. You know, how we envision things. A couple weeks ago, I drove up to upstate Michigan, and I was enjoying the drive. I was by myself. It was an up and back in the same day deal. I had to pick some stuff up. And I was closing in on my destination. It was just beautiful land and landscape. And I was driving along, and I turned down this, my GPS took me and turned here, and I turned, and I was going down this dirt road, and I noticed on the GPS it said I had like 4 miles to travel on this thing. So I went down there, and then I came to another turn, and it was like even a smaller dirt road. And I began to think about, where am I? Is this one of those things where you're getting set up? And here's what happened, and here's what really influenced us, because some miles back, about 20 or so miles back, I was driving down. It wasn't a highway, it was just, but a decent road, and I passed this sign. Do we have that picture of that? Hitchhikers may be escaping inmates, And there was a prison that I had passed early on. And so I saw that sign, and immediately it began shaping the story that I was telling myself about myself. I'm going down this dirt road, and I'm locking the doors, windows up. I stopped along the way for gas, and everybody that moved, I'm like suspicious of them, and I'm going on and on. And just because of that one thought. I began telling myself a story that, could have or may not have had any connection with reality. But it shaped my entire perspective. And I think we are so prone to that. And that's why I love in verse 20 where it says this young man came to his senses, right? Something shook him and said, wait a minute. Think about what you're thinking about. And it said he did that. He came to his senses. He got up and went home to his father. And we read that, and I think we just zoom right by it. And I just want to park on that part of the story this morning for a little while. And the title I have for this morning's message is It's a Long Road Home. And, I don't know, well, no, I don't. I spent some time in jail, okay? A few hours. And just rightly so. Okay, it was when I was junior high, and I was the guy picked me up. He put me in the jail cell. I think more to scare me than anything. But I overheard him call my dad, right? Talking to my dad, and he comes in to where I'm at. He looks at me and says, "Your dad's not coming to get you." And I'm like, oh, "This is bad, right?" So anyway, he says, "But I'm going to take you home." And I still remember that drive home. Wondering about and worrying about how this was all going to play out when I got there. What was my dad going to do? Maybe he won't let me in. He's got 7 boys. Maybe he'll just disown me. There's plenty to go around, Maybe he'll ground me till I'm 105. All those kind of things. And, it went okay, it was all that kind of stuff. But that drive home, and I remember that when I was reading the story, I said, I wonder what that walk was like home for this boy. We're not sure how far it was, but we are told it was a distant land. And he's broke. There's no subways. He's not on a highway. So I'm thinking he had a lot of time to think about his decision and how things may or may not go when he finally stood face to face with his father. And all these scenarios. You ever been there? Where you start telling stories in your head about things that you don't know yet, or what's going to happen when you get there, or when this happens, what's going to go on when you enter into that meeting. And we tell ourselves these stories. But here's what we need to realize. The scripture says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So we've got to be careful about the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so often, I think when we look at people's lives, and maybe some of you have been there in yourself, we keep repeating destructive patterns. And we think, why do you keep doing that? Why do you keep acting like that? Why do you keep going back to that? Why do you stay stuck in that? Why are you doing that? And I would suggest to you, because the root cause of that is because of the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves. And in this story, I want to highlight, I think, several dynamics, different kinds of stories that we can be telling ourselves about ourselves that really keep us stuck. And the first one comes out of verse 18, where this young man says, I will set out and I'll go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and sinned against you. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are guilt-driven and guilt-centered. I've sinned against you, I've sinned against God, I've sinned against my neighbor, I've sinned against Uncle Joe, and I'm just a sinner. Ever hear that? I hear Christians say that. We're all just sinners. And when we believe that story, it drives us to hide, the same thing as it did in the garden. If we understand that about ourselves, we are going to keep a safe distance away from coming face to face with God. And so we've all been there, right? We've done something wrong. We don't want to face it, so we'd rather just hide or just maybe wait it out. It's going to go by. But when we get stuck and we start telling ourselves that story about us, right? The devil kind of adds fuel to it, right? He doesn't even want you back, and you're no good anyway. Your father's finished with you. It's better off to hide. And we take that, and I was thinking about this boy and this story going on in his head. And remember, he left home because he had this story in his own mind that his father was controlling, he was overly restrictive, which is a false story, but now he has this story about going back to him, so it's kind of like compounding interest, right? And he's wrestling this through on his way back. I mean, how often do you think, maybe I ought to just go back, right? The pigs weren't so bad and all that kind of thing going on, right? But when we say to ourselves and tell ourselves about ourselves, well, I'm just a sinner, what if that's not true? Doesn't God say you've been redeemed, you've been bought out of that? Doesn't he say that you've been delivered from sin and guilt? So which story are you going to tell yourself about yourself? The one that you manufacture in your head, or the one that God has given you to live? But he doesn't stop there. He goes on in verse 19, and he says this, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And this is another and even more deadly kind of story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's a shame-centered story. And it goes beyond guilt. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And what shame does, guilt causes us to hide. Shame causes us to pretend. Somehow we think that if people really knew us, we're just not acceptable, we're just not lovable, and so we pretend with people. And what happened with this boy, somewhere along the line, he convinced himself, I am not worthy. And so many people do that, and we believe it. And so often we take the things that happen in our lives and we integrate them into our lives, right? Well, they walked out of me, or they said that about me, or something happened to me. And so we take it on as this, so there must be something wrong with me. I just must be a flawed human being or an unacceptable person, Everyone else may be, but I am not. And what happens when we accept these false stories about ourselves, it keeps us from living the lives that God created us to live. It keeps us from living who we really are created to be. And they keep us stuck. And especially when it's a story based in shame, right? We have this ongoing story going on in our heads that we are stuck in place, that we're unlovable, we're unacceptable, nobody really knows us, and we don't let them know us as well. But just think about this boy's thought for a minute. I am not worthy any longer to be your son. Was he ever worthy of that? He didn't get to be a son because of his worth. He got to be a son because of his birth. And so he was telling himself a false storyline, and he had come to believe it. And when that happens, again, we just get trapped in those places of self-destructive life. Third storyline that we tell ourselves oftentimes is procrastination-centered stories. And it's not as specific in this, but when he finally came to his senses, he finally said, I'm going to go home. I don't think that's the first time he thought of that. I'm guessing he had those thoughts multiple times over long periods of time. Man, I should just go home. But he kept putting it off, And aren't we great at fence sitting, especially when it comes to major decisions that are going to disrupt our lives some? We think, well, I'm not sure, I just want to be cautious, and what if I'm wrong? And so rather than find out the answer to that, we just don't decide and we stay stuck. We just put it off and put it off, I'm not sure, I got to be cautious. I love what Churchill said. He said, the moment I decide, I'm full of indecision. But we can't get stuck in that place. We can't allow procrastination become the story of our lives. And the older I get, the more aware of how little time we all have in this life, I mean, they say that when you get older, you kind of lose your filter. That may be so in some cases, but what I find is the older I get, the more urgent I feel about life. And so you have the courage to say things now that before you might have just kind of let it go, or, kind of watered it down some. When you were 30, you wouldn't do it, but now that, you're in your 60s, you just let them have it. This is what's going on. And the urgency of that, and the danger of living this story and telling a story, well, I'll get around to it. Someday I will. And I see this all the time, and I'm just going to say it. And if this is you, okay, I'm just going to say it, right? I'm over 60. So, it's one of those things. I see people, oh, yeah, I've been meaning to get back to church, and I'm When are you going to do it? Or much longer are you going to put it off? See, we get stuck in those places because of the story we tell ourselves. And so we stay stuck in a place distant from God. But we kind of get ourselves off the hook because we have these intentions about God. And that's a storyline of procrastination that is just deadly. And it cheats us out of life. So many lives get wasted and never lived because the person never gets to the place of making a firm decision about who they are and how they want to live. So, one other story, and this is a little bit bigger than that, I think, just storylines. I think this is something that happens when we think about our lives, especially when we have gaps. Do you ever hear of plot holes? Google it. It's something that happens in stories, right? And you watch a movie or something, especially a movie. If you Google it, they'll tell you all these movies that have big plot holes. And you'll see somebody, and like in one scene they get shot, and 30 seconds later they're running along, kind of what happened? How did that go on, right? In fact, here's a spoiler for you. Any Matrix fans? Matrix? Remember Cypher? The bad guy in there, he has that conversation with the bad guy about betraying everybody else. Well, the plot hole in that is nobody could get into the Matrix until somebody hooked them up and got them in there. So how did he ever get in there and nobody knew about it? See? That's a plot hole. But here's another plot hole in our lives. Our futures. Here's where we are, but what's going forward? And when we think about that and the storyline that we often have, and I think just more often than not, when things are uncertain about our lives, we fill the gaps with stories of fear. We just start running scenarios that are like horror movies, right? Oh man, this is going to go bad, and this is going to go bad, and this is going to turn out, and I'm going to lose this, and that's going to happen. And when we tell ourselves scary stories about our futures because they're unknown, and what happens is we are allowing fear to dictate our stories about ourselves rather than faith. And it robs us out of life. So, just intermediary question. The story that you're telling yourself about yourself, is it more fear-based or faith-based? It's an important one because it determines how we live and how we see things and how we handle things. And here's something that you need to know. We're not in charge of our circumstances by and large, or our situations. Have you recognized that yet? But you do choose the story that you live. You do. I mean, just think about the early church, right? Church is born, and the Christians start going out and telling everybody the good news about the resurrection, and they're getting persecuted, murdered, losing their families, losing their homes. But if you read the book of Acts, it's like, and the gospel kept going, and the church kept growing, right? And so they chose to, live that story and tell that story about themselves. They're part of something bigger than themselves. You get to choose the story that you're living with your life. We all do it. But oftentimes, because of the things we allow to seep in and the stuff we start to believe, we get confused about the story of our lives. DTD. I don't know. Do anybody have it? It is developmental topographical disorientation. It's a real condition. Developmental topographical disorientation. And in my version, a summary of what it means, you can't find your way out of a paper bag. Anybody have it? These are people that, just can't form a mental map of anything, right? And I think so many people live developmentally, topographically disoriented lives because they don't think about the story of their lives that they're telling themselves. And if we don't know who we are, then it's hard to discern where we are. And if we don't know where we are, it's hard to figure out where we need to be. And that's why God tells us the truth. And we've got to come to that place and believe what Jesus said and believe what history has shown. Because so many stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are birthed and anchored in lies and deceptions. You know, and so many, and what that means then is that so many stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves are actually rooted in sin. They're the deceiver, right? And the simple way that you can tell is because the single consequence of sin in our lives, it's the same across the board, no matter what it is. It causes us to live our lives distant from God. It always drives in that direction. Ephesians 2, in the Message, I think spells this out so clearly. I want to share it with you. First 3 verses, it says this: "It wasn't so long ago that you were mired in that old, stagnant life of sin. You let the world, which doesn't know the first thing about living, tell you how to live. You filled your lungs with polluted unbelief and then exhaled disobedience." We all did it. All of us doing what we felt like doing, when we felt like doing it, all of us in the same boat. It's a wonder God didn't lose his temper and do away with the whole lot of us. So we start telling ourselves stories about life that just are falsehoods. And we tell them to ourselves so often, we begin to believe in. When we begin to believe in, we start living them out. And they always lead us to a faraway land, distant from our Father in heaven who loves us. Now, in all these stories and all these scenarios, there's one underlying principle. Jesus said this in so many ways. All the stories have one or two main themes. Either we put ourselves at the center of the story or we put God at the center of the story. And that's the difference maker, right? And when we put ourselves at the center of our story, then the days that we live in that story are full of anxiety and worry and fear. And, we get in this place in the story of our lives where we're just so easily offended, so easily upset, ready to criticize. We live our days mostly afraid and all those kind of things, right? And we get in this place where we think, it's kind of like these things, right? Did you see how they looked at me? They don't like me, right? We start telling ourselves these kind of stories, or I texted them and it's been 30 seconds, so they must be mad at me now, right? And we because we put ourselves at the center of the story. And if you read this boy's rehearsed plan, look what he says: "I will set out. I will say to my Father, I have sinned. I am no longer," and on and on and on. "I am no longer worthy." And he's got himself at the center of the story. He's still failing to put his Father at the center of his life. And so even on his way back, he's still disoriented, still confused. And that is so easy to do, but it's so deadly to life, is it not? Think about that. It's been different kind of coming in and preaching. And for a couple weeks, there wasn't anybody here but the tech team, right? And so you can go, "Oh man, people must be mad at me. They don't like me. They don't like my preaching, and that's why they're not coming." And when our story that we tell ourselves about a story is centered on ourselves, that's where we go in our thinking, and it just cheats us out of life, And so you start getting out of that and say, "Well, they're not coming just because they stayed up and watched Kimmel till 1 o'clock, or whatever, right?" So we've got to be careful, and one of the big questions for today is, who's at the center of the story that you're telling yourself about yourself? If you're at the center, man, it's going to be a rough road. And you're going to miss out on life. And so this kid's having a go of it on his way home. So he got up and he went to his father, the scripture says. And I'm pretty sure that first step was kind of hard. When you initially decide, okay, I'm leaving that behind, I'm getting out of there. And there's people around. That's hard, but I don't think it was the hardest. I think the further along he went, the harder it got for him. Because he was rehearsing these stories about himself, to himself along the way. How's all this going to go, right? But, we've talked about this here in, our mission statement is helping people take their next steps towards God, right? And one of the stories that we tell ourselves, that we deceive ourselves with, is that, if that's the direction a God-like life and God-obedient life is meant to take, we tell ourselves, well, I can be taking steps this way, in disobedience to God, ignoring God, with me at the center and stuff, and still be close to Him. What if the stories we tell ourselves aren't true? See, an actual return to the Father, just like for this young man, meant a real departure from the current circumstances that are keeping us distant from Him. And that's not always easy, but the Scripture is clear on this, right? Choose this day who you will serve, right? I set before you life and death. Choose life. You cannot serve two masters. How long are you going to waver between two opinions? That's a call to decisiveness. It's a call to leave where you are, depart from the current things in your life, places that you are, ways you're thinking, all those kind of things that are not in sync with God and His heart and His desire, and start moving back home. I want to quote a great theologian and philosopher. Anybody see the Christopher Robin movie? Winnie the Pooh, right? And this the story of Christopher Robin. He left the 100-acre wood, and he's out doing this thing. And the point comes in the story where you realize he says he's lost something vital, part of his soul, almost. He says, and Pooh gives him this piece of counsel. Christopher, I always get to where I'm going by walking away from where I have been. If you're going to come home to the Father, then there are things in your life that you're going to have to walk away from. And that's not always easy. But it is always best. And then we know the story, right? Verse 20, while a long way off, his father saw him and ran. And I just wanted to say this to you. I saw it in my study. No one is ever too far away to come home. While you're still a long way off, that's a powerful phrase. When you are betraying the promises you made, when you're sleeping with people you're not to be sleeping with, and you're getting stoned or drunk and out of your mind, lying and gossiping, slandering, when you're filled with jealousy and self-centeredness and harboring bitterness and lust and pride, when you're angry and controlling, condescending and demeaning, hiding and pretending, while you're a long way off, the Father saw you and had compassion on you. He just can't help himself. You have never lived an unloved day your entire life. You've heard this song, right? Jesus loves you. Is that the story you tell yourself about yourself? And I saw one author took that and put a twist on it. He said, we love the song, Jesus loves me, this I know. How about this? Jesus knows me, this I love. It makes a difference, doesn't it? He knows you. There's no reason to tell yourself stories that are hidden in shame and guilt and all those kind of... He knows you and He still loves you. What if the story you're telling yourself about yourself is wrong? What if the story that God has about you is based in what we all know, but I think fail to tell ourselves often enough becomes where we own it and live in it? Jesus went to the cross because of His love for His Father. The Father sent His Son to the cross because of His love for you. Is that the story you tell yourself about God? About you? Your worth? So he comes home, the father blows right by all of his excuses, and all his planned speech and all this kind of stuff. And you know the story, right? The father buries this kid's explanations in his love and his embrace and his welcome, and he swallows up his shame and, this extravagant acceptance and welcome home. And it's like, you're home, and you're home. You don't know how long I've longed for this moment, that you're home. Is that how you picture the Father when He sees you? If not, maybe the story you're telling yourself about yourself just isn't true. I want to share a story with you that I think just exemplifies this more than any that I've been able to find. And story of a little girl who misunderstood her father's heart, and her name's Madeline, and Her dad's name was Joe. He's a butcher in Minnesota, and the girl's mother died when she was giving birth, and so the father raised her alone, except the grandma had lived with them and helped out, around the household. And so the story goes, 5-year-old Madeline, that's her name, climbed into her father's lap. "Did you have enough to eat?" he asked her. She smiled, patted her tummy, and said, "I can't eat any more." "Did you have some of your grandma's pie?" "A whole piece," she said. Father Joe looked across at the table at his mother. "Well, it looks like you filled us up. I don't think we'll be able to do anything tonight but go to bed." Madeline put her little hands on either side of her fat father's big face. "Oh, but Papa, this is Christmas Eve. You said we could dance." Her father Joe pretended not to remember. "Did I now? Well, I don't remember saying anything about dancing." Grandma smiled and shook her head as she began to clear the table. "But Papa," Madeline pleaded, "we always dance on Christmas Eve, just you and me, remember?" A smile burst from beneath his thick mustache. "Of course I remember, darling. How could I ever forget that?" And with that, he stood and took her hand in his. "Come on, Papa," she tugged at his hand. "Let's dance before everyone arrives." And she was right. Soon the doorbell would ring, and the relatives would fill the room, and the night would be past. But for now, it was just Papa and his little girl. Times passed. Years went by. Things changed. Rebellion flew into Joe's world like a Minnesota blizzard. At the time she was old enough to drive, Madeline decided she was old enough to lead her own life. And that life did not include her father. "I should have seen it coming," Joe would say, "but for the life of me, I didn't." He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to handle the change in appearance, the scanty clothes. He didn't understand the late nights and the poor grades. And most of all, he didn't know when to speak and when to be quiet. She, on the other hand, had it all figured out. She knew when to speak to her father. Never. She knew when to be quiet. Always. And then came the boyfriend. He was no good, and Joe knew it. And there's no way he was going to allow his daughter to spend Christmas Eve with that kid. "You'll be with us tonight, young lady. You'll be at your grandma's house eating your grandma's pie. You'll be with us on Christmas Eve." And she was. But though they were at the same table, they might as well have been different sides of the planet. Madeline sat at the table, played with her food, and said nothing. Grandma tried to talk to Joe, but he was in no mood to chat. Part of him was angry, part of him was heartbroken. And the rest of him would have given anything to know how to reach and reconnect with this girl who once sat on his lap. Soon relatives arrived, bringing with them a welcome end to the awkward silence. As the room filled with noise and people, Joe stayed on one side, Madeline sat cross-armed on the other. "Put on the music, Joe," reminded one of his brothers, and so he did. Thinking she would be honored, he turned and walked toward his daughter. "Will you dance with your papa tonight?" The way she huffed and turned, you'd think he'd insulted her. In full view of the family, she walked out the front door and marched down the sidewalk, leaving her father alone. Madeline came back that night, but not for long. In their last days together, her father tried so hard. He made her favorite dinner she refused to eat. He invited her to watch a movie. She stayed in her room. He bought her a new dress. She didn't even say thank you. And then there was the spring day. He left work early to be at the house when she arrived home from school. And wouldn't you know it, that was the day she never came home. A friend saw her and her boyfriend down by the bus station. The authorities confirmed the purchase of a ticket to Chicago. Where she went from there was anybody's guess. Her boyfriend had a cousin. The cousin worked the night shift at a convenience store south of Houston. For a few bucks a month, he would let the runaways stay in his apartment at night, but they had to be out during the day, which was fine with them. They had big plans. He was going to be a mechanic, and Madeline just knew she'd get a job at a local department store. Of course, he knew nothing about cars, and she knew even less about getting and holding a job. But you don't think of the things like that when you're dead set on the freedom of doing whatever you want, the way you want. After a couple of weeks, the cousin changed his mind. The day he announced his decision they had to go, the boyfriend also announced his, that he was leaving. Madeline found herself facing the night with no place to sleep or hand to hold. And this was the first of many such nights. A woman in the park told her about a homeless shelter near the bridge. For a couple of bucks, she could get a bowl of soup and a cot. She used her backpack as a pillow and jacket for a blanket. The room was so rowdy it was hard to sleep. Madeline turned her face to the wall. For the first time in several days, she thought of the whiskered face of her father kissing her goodnight. But as her eyes began to water, she refused to cry. She pushed the memory of home deep inside and determined to keep it there. She had gone too far to go back. The next morning, the girl in the cot beside her showed a fistful of tips she'd made from dancing on tables. "This is the last night I'll have to stay here," she said. "Now I can pay for my own place." "Hey, they told me they're looking for another girl. You should come by." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a matchbook. "Here's the address." Madeline's stomach turned at the thought. All she could say was, "I'll think about it." She spent the rest of the week on the streets looking for work. At the end of the week, when it was time to pay her bill at the shelter, she reached in her pocket and pulled out all she had left, the matchbook. "I won't be staying the night," she said, and walked out the door. Life, especially when it gets hard, has a way of softening our convictions. When you find yourself in a place of want, you'll do things you never dreamed you'd do. If Madeline knew anything, she knew how to dance. Her father had taught her well. Now, men the age of her father watched her. She didn't rationalize it. She just didn't let herself think about it. She simply did her work and took their dollars and grew accustomed to living in her shame. She might have never thought about home except for the letters. The cousin brought them, not one or two, but a box full, all addressed to her, all from her father. "Your old boyfriend must have squealed on you. He's come 2 or 3 a week," complained the cousin. "Give him your address." Oh, but she couldn't do that. He might find her. She couldn't just throw them away, nor could she bear to open them. She knew what they said. He wanted her home. But if he knew what she was doing, where she was, who she had become, he would not be writing or wanting. Still the letters came, still she saved them, unread. She kept them in the dressing room at the dance club, organized according to postmark. She would look at them, but never opened a single one. Life went on. Most days Madeline was able to numb the longings. Thoughts of home and feelings of shame were shoved into the same part of her heart, locked and lost there, so she thought. But on occasions they would momentarily break out. Like the time she saw a dress in the clothing store window, a dress the same color as the one her father had purchased her, a dress that had been too plain for her. With much reluctance, she put it on and stood with him before the mirror. "My, you're as tall as I am," he told her. She stiffened to his touch. And now, seeing her weary face reflected in the store window, Madeline realized she would give 1,000 dresses to feel his arm around her again and hear his voice. She left the store and resolved never to pass by it again. In time, leaves fell, the air chilled, the mail still came, and the cousin still complained, and the stacks of letters grew. Still she refused to read or throw away. And a few days before Christmas Eve, another letter arrived. Same shape, same color, but this one had no postmark, and it was not delivered by the cousin. It was sitting on her dressing room table. "A couple of days ago, a big man stopped by and asked me to give this to you," explained one of the dancers. "He said you'd understand the message." "He was here?" she asked. Suppose it was him. Madeline swallowed hard and looked at the envelope. She opened it and removed the card. It read, "I know where you are. I know what you do. This doesn't change who you are or alter one bit the way I feel. What I have said in each letter still holds true." But she didn't know what they said. She kept the letters but never read one. So Madeline pulled a letter from the top of the stack and read it, then a second, a third. Each letter had the same exact sentence. Each sentence asked the same exact question. In a matter of moments, the floor was littered with open envelopes and letters. Madeline's face was streaked with tears. Within an hour, she was on a bus. One single thought occupied her mind: "I hope I can make it in time." She barely did. As she arrived at the house, the relatives were starting to leave. Joe was in another room with his mother when his brother called from the suddenly quiet den. "Joe, someone is here to see you." And Joe stepped out of the kitchen and stopped dead in his tracks. There stood his little girl. In one hand, her backpack. In the other, she held a letter. As he looked into her face, He saw the question in her eyes. And Madeline spoke first. The answer is yes, she said to her father. If the invitation is still good, the answer is yes. Joe swallowed hard. Oh my, the invitation is always good. And so on that night, in that home, once more the two, father and daughter, at home together, danced. And on the floor near the door rested a letter with Madeline's name and her father's request. Will you come home and dance with your papa again? Maybe today you're in a distant land. You're telling yourself a story about yourself that's taking you far away from your Father's home and your Father's love and your Father's will. He sent you a letter, countless letters, the same request, anchored in the same longing. Will you come home and dance? If you're far away, if you strayed, it doesn't matter where you've been, what you've done, how long, how dark the story is. You've never lived a minute of your life unloved by your Father. He just wants you to come home. Will you do that today? Will you leave that place? Will you set your feet and walk home into his loving embrace? And dance. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for your love for us, for how relentless you are in it, so how much you long after us, how deeply you long for us. So the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves is a story that you have written, the life that you have created us for. So Lord, I pray this morning, if anybody is living a different story, they would hear you offer the same wondrous offer to come home. And whatever voices are in their heads, Lord, whatever stories are being told about themselves, by themselves, Lord, that if they're contrary to yours, silence those. Stories that are anchored in fear. Stories that are centered and driven by shame or guilt. Stories that are just being failed to live because of maybe paralyzed of making a decision. Lord, deceptive stories that we can live in a distant land and still be close with you. Lord, I pray. People would hear your invitation and find their way home. And as you tell us in this story, to enjoy a celebration beyond imagination. Because when we're away from you, we're dying. When we come home to you, we're home. So I pray, if anybody's far away, today would be the day they come home. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.